The Chinese nation, a nation as great as it is ancient, has undergone countless political, economic, and social transformations throughout its rich and extensive history, which over time have changed its appearance. However, one of the most important periods for understanding China today is the one known as the Century of Humiliation, which spans from 1839 to 1949. This period is called that because of the humiliating, degrading, and shameful condition in which China found itself for a little over a century in the face of foreign powers such as the United Kingdom, France, the United States, Russia, and Japan. During this century, China lived at the mercy of economic and colonial exploitation by these powers, which carried out military incursions in various parts of the country. They obtained the signing of disadvantageous treaties and agreements, committed all kinds of abuses and excesses, and coerced the Chinese imperial government into granting all their demands. This generated what, in the long run, many experts have described as a genuine hatred from China toward everything that represents the Western world. Join us today to learn in detail about the events that make up the Century of Humiliation and the connection it has with the current international policy of the Qing giant. My name is Alessandro Polentino, and this is the New Encyclopedia. But before we start with today's story, we want to invite you to support our channel, to subscribe, to leave your likes, and to leave your comments. We read all of them, so share our videos with each of your friends and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. So, without anything else to add, let's begin today's story. Before discussing the Century of Humiliation, we should review the historical records of the Chinese nation. Chinese civilization enters history with the rise of small sedentary communities, with village farming cultures around the year 5000 before Christ, which developed through trade with Western Asia, increasingly complex institutions, industries, and social classes. Little by little, these communities grew and formed a system of government ruled by a leader who, upon dying, passed power to his descendants, thus giving rise to the first Chinese dynasties around the year 2000 before Christ. However, it was the Qing Dynasty, which existed between 221 and 206 before Christ, the first to unify all the dynasties present in what is now Chinese territory, establishing an imperial system that laid the foundations for future dynasties. Thus, over the centuries, various dynasties such as the Han, the Tang, and the Ming contributed to the development of Chinese civilization, promoting advances in agriculture, technology, architecture, the arts, literature, and commerce, making China a nation with a unique cultural wealth in the world. However, many years later, while the Ming Dynasty was in power, it faced several internal and external challenges that eventually led to its downfall. Invaders from the region of Manchuria in the year 1644. Thus, the so-called Qin Dynasty was established, which imposed the traditions and customs of the Manchu region on the rest of China. Because of this, for much of the Chinese community, the Qin were always considered invaders. The Qin initially consolidated their power and expanded the territory of the empire, leading it to what some historians have considered a Chinese golden age by the early 19th century. Politically, in the Qin Dynasty, power was concentrated in the emperor, supported by a complex state bureaucratic network. This bureaucratic structure is key to controlling a vast and diverse territory, which includes ethnic groups such as the Mongols, Tibetans, and Uyghurs, integrated through tributary and administrative systems. In addition to this public administration, which by this time was beginning to show serious signs of corruption, there was also an imperial army, which, although effective in its early years, soon began to show signs of decline. On the other hand, the foreign policy of the Qin is based on their tributary system, through which neighboring states recognize Chinese supremacy. In exchange for protection and trade, a system that promoted a certain regional stability based on their historical traditions and economic self-sufficiency, but that limited the empire and restricted the development of diplomatic relations with Western powers. At that time, although China was not completely closed to trade with the West, it did regulate it very strictly and with severe restrictions. In fact, the only Chinese port that European ships could access was the port of Canton, located in the south of China. This was not only due to the reasons of self-sufficiency just described, but also because of an idiosyncratic aspect, quite peculiar to the Chinese. Within their conviction as a people, the Chinese saw themselves as the pinnacle of civilization, as an ancient and vigorous nation that was the center of the universe, while they considered Westerners to be weak, barbaric, and uncivilized beings. This aspect will be of crucial importance later on. As for its economy, Qin China was one of the world's greatest economic powers, thanks to its enormous state population, estimated at 300 million people by the year 1839, and with its advanced agricultural techniques. Among other things, it included the use of fertilizers and sophisticated irrigation systems. Agriculture at that time was still the fundamental basis of the economy, with crops such as rice, wheat, millet, and tea. And the demographic expansion drives the intensification and colonization of new lands. In turn, the manufacturing sector, although isolated from the rest of the world, was also very well developed, with silk, porcelain, cotton fabrics, and handcrafted products that were internationally appreciated standing out. Although there were technical advances in some areas, the Chinese economy showed limited industrialization and mechanization compared to Europe, which quickly became a weakness against the industrialized powers. Thus, in summary, by the beginning of the 19th century, China was a large country, both geographically and demographically, with significant agricultural production and prominent manufacturing of products that were, of course, in international demand. However, it suffered from military and industrial weakness, which sooner or later would make it an easy prey for the Western powers. These powers, particularly the United Kingdom, were going through an equally interesting period characterized by the search for new markets and the expansion of their commercial interests throughout the world. Thus, all the circumstances were set for the first clashes between China and the West to occur very soon. In this context, the first violent confrontation between the Chinese and Westerners took place during the so-called Opium Wars. On this fascinating topic, we have an interesting video on our channel where we tell in detail the story of that conflict, considered by some as the first drug war in human history. In summary, the main cause of the First Opium War was the Chinese government's refusal to allow the United Kingdom to commercially enter the country. This was because this substance, when consumed, had addictive psychotropic effects that were harmful to the population, which was beginning to show high rates of drug addiction. As a result, the Chinese government confiscated and destroyed the English opium warehouses in the port of Canton at the beginning of 1839. But this action was not well received by the English, who began military reprisals.
El 18 de marzo de 1830.
The English defended themselves militarily due to their technological superiority compared to the Chinese, who were technologically behind the English power. In this sense, China was left completely at the mercy of the English. After their crushing defeat in the First Opium War, a series of events began to unfold. The humiliation turns into... First of all, the Treaty of Nanking was signed in China by the Qing Dynasty on August 29, 1842. This treaty also forced China to pay large sums of money with very high interest as compensation to the British government and the opium traders. It broke the strict isolation that had characterized China's trade relations, and consequently, its political and cultural relations with the rest of the world. Through the Treaty of Nanking, 4 more ports were opened, in addition to Canton, where the British could trade freely and with tariff advantages. In addition, the Chinese government was forced to cede the island of Hong Kong, which was given in perpetuity to the British, who now had an important enclave that quickly became a thorn in the side for the Chinese. At the same time, China grants the Nanking War, the War of Nanking, the One of Nanking,
y solo podrán ser regulados por los consulados británicos en China.
the Nanking, the One of the War of Nanking.
Una serie de acuerdos
Thus,
y otros países occidentales que resultan en detrimento del gigante asiático. Así,
the United States with the Treaty of Wenghia and France with the Treaty of Whampoa, both from the year 1844, demand and obtain the same terms: commercial and territorial privileges that the British had obtained in the Treaty of Nanking. In this sense, the first Opium War and the first unequal treaties that followed it mark the initial years of the century of humiliation, in which China not only loses an important part of its sovereignty, but is also economically subjugated with tariffs that make it impossible to protect its industry, leaving it at the mercy of Western powers, which will soon cause several internal problems. This disgraceful situation does not go unnoticed by the Chinese population, who begin to look unfavorably upon the Qing dynasty, leading to the first uprisings against them, including the so-called Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion began in November of 1850 with a series of uprisings that quickly escalated into a civil war, which would last almost 14 years.
años de beligerancia.
The rebellion, which later turned into a war, had from the very beginning a political connotation against the Qing dynasty. Remember that it was made up of members from the Manchu region, who were always seen as foreigners by the majority of the Chinese population. The purpose of the revolt is to openly fight the Qing and start a revolution that would bring peace and prosperity to all Chinese people. Thus, the revolt is led by Hong Xiquan, who proclaims the so-called Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace, a revolutionary religious state that challenges the legitimacy of the Qing dynasty and proposes a radical transformation, not only political, but also social, economic, and religious throughout the entire empire. The Western powers, benefiting from the unequal treaties, quickly rushed to provide military support to the Qing dynasty, because another rhetoric of the Taiping rebels was that the foreign presence in Chinese territory should end, or at least be limited. Although this alliance between the foreign powers and the Qing is merely circumstantial, because while they are fighting the Taiping rebels, the Western powers resume, in October of the year 1856, hostilities against the Qing dynasty, again over issues related to opium, taking place during the so-called Second Opium War, named so because it was the continuation of the conflict from 1839. The Second Opium War began with the incident of the British ship Arrow on October 8, 1856. On that day, it was detained by Chinese authorities on suspicion of smuggling, which England used as a pretext to declare war. The purpose of the Western powers with this war was to resolve issues that had not been fully clarified after the First Opium War, such as the expansion and consolidation of Western commercial and diplomatic privileges. War, including the long-awaited legalization of the opium trade. Thus, during the war, the British and French launched several military attacks, including the bombardment and capture of the city of Canton on December 31, 1857, after which they advanced toward Beijing, the capital of China. Then, in June 1856, China, having surrendered, signed the Treaty of Tianjin with the United Kingdom, France, and Russia, which joined the group of nations with interests in China. Among other things, this treaty includes the following stipulations. First, the opening of new ports to international trade, in addition to those already opened by the Treaty of Nanjing. Second, permission for Western powers to establish permanent diplomatic legations in Beijing, a city that until then had been closed to foreigners. Third,
la legalización total del comercio del opio. Cuarto, derecho para los
foreigners to freely navigate the Yangtze River, the longest in the country, and which connected it from east to west. Fifth, free movement of foreigners within China, including the practice of commercial activities and Christian missionary work. Sixth, financial compensation to the British and French for war expenses and damages suffered by their merchants. And seventh, prohibition of the use of offensive terms towards foreigners in official Chinese documents. Clearly, the Chinese resistance to a treaty worse and more humiliating than the Treaty of Nanjing was immediate, delaying its implementation and prolonging the fighting. In this regard, in 1860, British and French troops definitively captured Beijing. During this violent offensive, the Westerners destroyed and set fire to the Summer Palace, a symbol of the imperial power of the Qin. Finally, truly against the ropes, the Chinese signed the so-called Convention of Beijing with the Western powers on October 24, 1860. In this convention, the Chinese finally accepted the stipulations of the Treaty of Tianjin, adding new clauses, such as the definitive legalization of opium, the stipulation of new war indemnities, and the cession of the Kowloon Peninsula as part of the Second Opium War. It is the second major blow that China has suffered at the hands of Western powers since 1839, which further accelerates the already existing discredit of the Qin and the distrust towards Westerners, who until not long ago were seen as mere savages by the Chinese community, but who now keep trampling them in every conflict they find themselves in. Going back to the Taiping Rebellion, which, let's remember, had started before the Second Opium War, as time goes by, it claims hundreds of thousands of lives, eventually becoming one of the bloodiest wars in all of human history. By its end, in 1864, it left a death toll of between 20 and 50 million people. The conflict ends with the defeat of the rebels by the Qing Dynasty, which was supported by foreign powers. This means that if the unpopularity of the Qin due to their Manchu origins was already intense, the animosity against them increases considerably as a result of the support they received from foreign powers during the rebellion. And even more so considering that not long ago the Convention of Beijing had been held with those same powers, with its controversial consequences. This further erodes the Qin government's authority and weakens China's ability to defend itself as a nation, a fact that, in a very short time, will cost the Asian giant dearly. Thus, faced with a discredited and economically and militarily weak China, foreign powers seek to increasingly encroach on the territories of the Qin dynasty. In this context, on August 22, 1884, the so-called Franco-Chinese War begins, in which, as its name indicates, China and France enter a period of hostilities over control of the Tonkin region, which comprises the north of present-day Vietnam. That region had historically been under Chinese influence through a system of tributary domination. However, France, which sought to consolidate its power in the so-called Indochina, decided to invade the Tonkin region with the support of the natives. During this conflict, the clear weakness of the Chinese army and its disadvantage in practically all military aspects became evident, while France made use of its management discipline. In this case, France becomes one of the main French parties, the French Border War, the French War. In this case, the border is one of the main parties of the French War. It becomes the result of this, the so-called China,
Es la victoria de Francia,
which signs the Treaty of Tianjin with China on June 9, 1885. In this treaty, China cedes full control of the Tonkin region. Tonkin, during this time, giving France the authority to establish the Hucha. In turn, China opens 11 new ports to foreigners for commercial, tourism, and Christian missionary activities. And, at the same time, it authorizes trade routes in several border cities with the Tonkin region, such as Mengshi, Manhao, and Longshu. where French citizens will be able to reside with full rights and will have reduced taxation, thus facilitating trade and French influence in the region bordering China. The French presence in Tonkin and throughout Indochina was viewed very negatively by the Chinese, as if it wasn't enough that for the past 46 years the country had been intervened by foreign powers. Now these powers were dominating its historical spheres of influence. However, Indochina would not be the only historical sphere of influence of the Chinese that would be taken away from the Asian giant, because 10 years later, in 1984, the so-called First Sino-Japanese War began. This war broke out because Japan, which for millennia had been a hermetically closed nation, began to open up to the outside world and to modernize economically and militarily, to undertake the formation of a great empire like that of the Western powers throughout the Asian continent.
Así, el primero
Latin American. The main interest of the Japanese is the Korean Peninsula, which at that time was a tributary state of Qing China. Thus, after the Japanese invasion of Korea in July 1894, China declared war on August 1 of that same year, Latin American. However, if the defeat against the French had been considered terrible, the defeat against the Japanese was even worse. In 6 months of conflict, the Chinese gained practically nothing and were continuously defeated by Japan. In battles such as the one at the Yellow Sea in September 1894, on Shonku in November 1894, and Weihaiwei in February 1895. At the same time, important points for maritime trade, such as the port of Port Arthur, fell into Japanese hands. The key behind China's crushing defeat lay more in its army than in its military technology. In fact, the Chinese in this conflict were better armed than the Japanese. However, the strong preparation and discipline of the Japanese army, compared to the disorganized Chinese army, which showed shortcomings throughout the conflict, is what made the difference in the Japanese victory. Finally, by March 1895, the Japanese were at the gates of Beijing, and the Qing Dynasty is forced to make peace, granting China freedom and recognizing the independence of Korea. China's treatment in the war for freedom against the Japanese turned China into one of the main Latin American powers. In the Treaty of Shimonoseki, China recognizes the independence of Korea. That independence will be purely nominal, because in reality, Korea comes under indirect Japanese control of the territory. Thus, another area of significant historical influence was taken away from China, just as had happened with Indochina and France a few years earlier. However, Korea is not the only area whose control China loses, as it also has to cede territory to the Japanese. The important island of Taiwan, right in the middle of the China Sea, as well as the Pescadores Islands north of Taiwan and the Liaodong Peninsula, all of which come under Japanese control. In turn, China is forced to pay millions in compensation to Japan. In turn, such as allowing this power to trade freely in all the country's ports, and to grant its citizens the same extraterritorial rights that citizens of countries like the United Kingdom and France already had? By the end of the turbulent 19th century, China's general situation of humiliation and disgrace was no secret to anyone, least of all to the Chinese themselves. They had witnessed a radical change in their way of life over the past decades. Now, foreigners ruled more than the Qing government itself, and the foreigners were introducing their culture, their inventions, their religion, and their customs with increasing force. Aspects that were always seen by the Chinese as despicable, in contrast to their values and traditions, which they saw as superior in every way. Thus, a strong resentment grew among the Chinese toward foreigners, finally erupting in the so-called Boxer Rebellion on October 18, 1899. The Boxer Rebellion, named so because its members practiced a martial art called Chinese boxing, began with a series of violent campaigns by the so-called Secret Society of Yetuan, a group of workers and peasants. Chinese who, since October 1899, dedicated themselves to burning churches and Christian communities, both European and Chinese converts located in northern China, especially in Shandong province. After these events, uncertainty reigns among the Boxers, as they do not know what the Chinese government's response to these events will be. However, in January of the year 1900, the then Empress Cixi of the Qing Dynasty issued several decrees in which she publicly supported the Boxers in their fight against foreigners and in general against foreign domination. In this sense now, with the support of the Empress, the Boxers increased their actions. During the spring of 1900, not only in Shandong, but they also spread throughout China, increasing the violence against Christian communities, foreign citizens, and even Chinese people who converted to Christianity or became westernized, according to their words. The violence unleashed by the Boxers included murders of both ordinary citizens and those suspected of being pro-Western, as well as prominent figures such as the German ambassador Clemens von Kettler, who was shot and killed in cold blood in June 1900. At the same time, the violence also includes real civilian massacres in Christian communities, with casualties sometimes exceeding 100. And the Boxers also carry out numerous acts of sabotage, such as cutting telegraph lines, destroying railways, and blocking ports. The violence of the Boxers reaches its peak at the end of May 1900, when a large number of Christians and foreigners take refuge in the walled diplomatic quarter, located east of Tiananmen Square in Beijing, and very close to the imperial city, where the emperors lived. The diplomatic quarter was the area of the Chinese capital where all the legations and embassies of foreign powers with business in China were located. Thus, on June 20, the Boxers begin the so-called Siege of the International Legations, starting a series of continuous shootings, fires, and explosions to harass the foreigners besieged in the diplomatic quarter. That same day, Empress Cixi declared war on the 8 foreign powers that had business in China, namely the United States, Japan, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, and even Austria-Hungary. Back in the diplomatic quarter, while they remain under siege, the representatives of the foreign powers, to whom China had just declared war, send out messages of alert to their respective countries, requesting support from foreigners. In this regard, the foreign powers formed the so-called 8-Nation Alliance to jointly address the situation concerning their interests in China. The force of the 8-Nation Alliance was composed as follows: 20,840 Japanese, 13,150 Russians, 12,020 British, 3,520 French,
3.420 estadounidenses,
900 Germans, 80 Italians, and 75 Austro-Hungarians, making a total of 54,000 soldiers, to which several anti-Boxer Chinese are also added, bringing the total to 55,000 soldiers of the League of Nations, which in turn has the impressive support of 18 warships. Thus, the 8-Nation Alliance arrives in Beijing on the afternoon of August 14, 1900. They immediately break through the Boxer siege and rescue the foreigners and Christians who had taken refuge in the diplomatic quarter after a full 55 days of siege. After this, the 8-Nation Alliance advances with its troops into Chinese territory, mainly in the coastal regions, and a series of reprisals begin in which numerous excesses are committed by both sides. For example, some accounts mention looting and burning of entire villages, arbitrary beheadings of innocent civilians by Allied soldiers, and also mass rapes of Chinese women. On the other hand, Other accounts mention that the Boxers killed a large number of foreign soldiers and then hung their bodies on walls throughout Beijing, as well as mass executions of missionaries and Christian citizens, which in total amounted to 136 missionaries and 53 Protestant children, 47 Catholic Christian soldiers, 30,000 Chinese Catholics, and 2,000 Chinese Protestants were executed by the Boxers as an act of revenge. Finally, the foreigners ended up imposing themselves on the Chinese and forced the Qing government to sign the so-called Boxer Protocol on September 7, 1901. The Boxer Protocol brought with it new and humiliating demands for the Chinese government. Among them was a high debt of 450 taels of silver, a sum that was more than double China's annual income, and it had to be paid over a period of 39 years with 4% annual interest. At the same time, the importation of weapons into Chinese territory was prohibited, and the destruction of military buildings such as the Taku Fort was ordered. In addition, all secret societies were abolished, and a series of punishments were initiated against the Boxers and government officials who took part in attacks against foreigners during the uprising. These punishments range from execution, exile, life imprisonment, and posthumous demotions. And finally, the diplomatic quarter, where foreigners took refuge throughout the uprising, was given a new status, coming under the control of foreign powers, with the authority to maintain armed troops there and to prohibit the presence of Chinese people in that district. In this way, China welcomed the new century with the signing of another unequal treaty. This, combined with the general instability of the country, had a strong impact on the irritated psyche of the Chinese people, who sooner rather than later would organize new revolutions to overthrow the Qing government. The dynasty that, in their eyes, had brought great and strong China to the most humiliating period in its entire history.
Aunque los sucesos relacionados con el siglo de la humillación no fueron la causa principal de la caída de la dinastía Qing, sí ejercieron una gran influencia. En este sentido, tras la muerte de la emperatriz Cixi en noviembre de 1908 y el ascenso de su sobrino el emperador Puyi, tiene lugar el levantamiento de Wuchang, el 10 de octubre de 1911, en el que tienen un papel protagónico altos miembros del ejército, gente de la nobleza local, el campesinado y organizaciones revolucionarias como el Tomenhui, liderado por el nacionalista Sun Yat-sen, quien, formado al calor de las ideas republicanas y liberales del siglo XIX, propone que China se convierta en una república democrática, tal cual como las de Occidente. Este levantamiento marca el inicio formal de la llamada Revolución de Qinghai, que se irá extendiendo por toda China y en la cual las viejas estructuras dinásticas van siendo reducidas hasta que, el 12 de febrero de 1912, el último emperador de China, el emperador Puyi, abdica en favor de los revolucionarios, acabando con más de 2000 años de tradición dinástica en China. De acuerdo a varios estudiosos, aunque tanto el levantamiento de Wuchang como la revolución de Qinghai, entre otras cosas, tienen una retórica antiimperialista y anti-intervencionista con respecto a las potencias extranjeras que tenían negocios y tratados con China desde el siglo pasado, estas mismas potencias, sobre todo Estados Unidos y Japón, brindaron importante apoyo logístico y financiero a los revolucionarios, y especialmente al líder Sun Yat-sen, porque, según algunos, con el nuevo orden en China, esperaban pactar con el gobierno entrante para mantener sus tratados y prerrogativas. Volviendo a los hechos, los revolucionarios liderados por Sun Yat-sen establecen en Nankín un gobierno provisional cuya presidencia terminan por delegar en un hombre del ejército, llamado Yuan Shikai, en ese mismo 12 de febrero de 1912. Sin embargo, al poco tiempo, Yuan Shikai empieza a concentrar el poder de manera totalitaria, convirtiéndose en una especie de dictador que empieza a perseguir todo tipo de oposición política, incluidos los nacionalistas revolucionarios de Sun Yat-sen con los que hace poco había colaborado. Esta dictadura de Shikai dura hasta su muerte en 1916. Tras este suceso, entre 1917 y 1920, Sun Yat-sen establece una serie de gobiernos rebeldes en la ciudad de Cantón, que aunque no gozan todavía de reconocimiento internacional, hacen lo posible para acabar con la anarquía imperante en China. Durante estos años, se generan en el interior de China una gran cantidad de gobiernos provinciales dirigidos por los llamados señores de la guerra, que eran caudillos militares que asumen la jefatura de las provincias ante un prácticamente inexistente gobierno central. A la par, desde el exterior, las potencias extranjeras presionan para sacar provecho de la situación en China. Por su parte, los británicos instan a la región del Tíbet a independizarse, y los japoneses amenazan a China con invadir Shandong y la región de Manchuria. Mientras todo esto sucede, dos grandes fuerzas políticas entran en escena. Por su parte, el Partido Nacionalista, también llamado Kuomintang, fundado formalmente por Sun Yat-sen en 1919, sobre la base construida en el grupo revolucionario Tomenhui. Y por otra parte, el Partido Comunista Chino, fundado por varias personalidades influidas por los sucesos de la Revolución Rusa, entre los cuales sobresale, con el paso del tiempo, un joven de 28 años de nombre Mao Zedong, del cual contamos con un interesante video en nuestro canal que les invitamos a ver. Al poco tiempo, el 12 de marzo de 1925, Sun Yat-sen muere inesperadamente y la dirigencia del Kuomintang y el gobierno paralelo en Cantón pasan a ser dirigidos por un joven militar llamado Chiang Kai-shek, de quien también contamos con un muy buen video en nuestro canal. Entre 1927 y 1928, Chiang Kai-shek emprende las campañas militares en el interior de China y, en alianza con los comunistas, logra poner fin a los señores de la guerra, estabiliza el país y conforma un gobierno reconocido internacionalmente en la ciudad de Nankín, iniciando lo que se ha conocido como la década de Nankín, de 1928 a 1938. Sin embargo, no acababa de unificarse el país cuando, por discordias y rencillas entre los comunistas de Mao y los nacionalistas de Chiang Kai-shek, cuando estalla la Guerra Civil China, el 1 de agosto de 1927. Misma guerra, la cual por su extensión y múltiples enfoques merece un video aparte. En la primera etapa del conflicto, es decir, entre 1927 y 1936, las potencias extranjeras quedan divididas entre las que apoyan al Kuomintang y las que apoyan al Partido Comunista. Viendo amenazados sus intereses y concesiones comerciales en ciudades portuarias como Shanghái, Tianjin y Hong Kong, el grupo de potencias de Estados Unidos, Francia, la Alemania de Weimar y el Reino Unido prestan apoyo técnico y militar al Kuomintang. Este apoyo constó en su momento de elementos como artillería, tanques Panzer I, bombarderos Heinkel y particularmente 7 divisiones de soldados alemanes. Por su parte, la recién fundada Unión Soviética, por razones de afinidad ideológica como de sustentación geopolítica global, se alía con el Partido Comunista dirigido por Mao. Dado que la Unión de Repúblicas Socialistas Soviéticas vivía una situación limitada económicamente, este decide colaborar con los comunistas chinos con apoyo diplomático y logístico en las áreas rurales cercanas a la frontera chino-soviética, y también con el envío de un total de 100.000 soldados durante todo el conflicto. Sin embargo, pronto vendrán para la fragmentada y humillada China días peores, pues en julio de 1937, el Japón liderado por el emperador Hirohito y que ya había ocupado desde 1931 la región china de Manchuria, invade formalmente el norte del territorio chino, desatando lo que se ha conocido como la Segunda Guerra Sino-Japonesa. Como mencionamos anteriormente, Japón había ocupado la región china de Manchuria desde 1931 e incluso había fundado un estado títere llamado Manchukuo. Ahora, en plena guerra civil china, los japoneses invaden el norte de China como parte del plan de engrandecimiento de Japón como la potencia dominante y hegemónica en toda Asia. Esta guerra se desarrolla en consonancia con la Segunda Guerra Mundial en Europa, pues el emperador Hirohito de Japón constituye con el Führer alemán Adolf Hitler y el duce italiano Benito Mussolini las llamadas Fuerzas del Eje, con el pacto tripartito de septiembre de 1940. En este sentido, los nacionalistas y comunistas en China ponen una tregua a la guerra civil y se unen al llamado Frente Unido para repeler a los japoneses, acción que también realizan las potencias que respaldan a cada bando. En este sentido, Estados Unidos, Francia, Reino Unido y la Unión Soviética apoyan a los chinos del Frente Unido en su lucha contra los japoneses. Sin embargo, esta lucha resulta ser ineficaz, pues entre agosto de 1937 y mayo de 1938, las principales ciudades chinas como Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghái y Nankín caen en manos de las disciplinadas e incansables tropas japonesas, las cuales mantendrán dominada toda China hasta 1945. Los japoneses abren en China uno de los episodios más sangrientos de todo el siglo de la humillación, con sucesos como la masacre de Nankín, realizada entre 1937 y 1938, en la que se estima que murieron hasta 300.000 chinos producto de ejecuciones masivas, torturas y violaciones cometidas por el ejército japonés. A la par, los japoneses emprenden la destrucción y saqueo de varias ciudades del interior de China, donde destruyen importantes sitios culturales y religiosos, como pasó en las regiones de Shaanxi y Suzhou. A su vez, la ocupación japonesa tiene inmensas consecuencias sociales y humanitarias, pues miles de chinos mueren a causa de la pobreza y el hambre, sin contar los cientos de chinos civiles y prisioneros de guerra que fueron llevados a la temible Unidad 731, en la cual los chinos realizan un gran número de experimentos químicos y biológicos mediante pruebas mortales, las cuales, según algunos, constituyen auténticos crímenes de guerra. No obstante, el final de la ocupación japonesa no sucede desde dentro, sino que viene de afuera. Mientras que entre abril y mayo de 1945 la Segunda Guerra Mundial ya había terminado en Europa, con la rendición de Italia y Alemania, Japón acuerda la rendición tras los bombardeos atómicos de Hiroshima y Nagasaki, en agosto de ese mismo año 1945, cesando así uno de los episodios más controvertidos en la historia de China y del mundo entero. Tras la rendición de Japón, este emprende el retiro de sus tropas de China en septiembre de 1945, un mes después de la rendición. Apenas se retiran las tropas japonesas, los nacionalistas y los comunistas chinos, brevemente unidos por la tregua, reanudan la guerra civil, apoyados por Estados Unidos y la Unión Soviética respectivamente. La segunda parte del conflicto civil chino dura hasta 1949. Pues las tropas nacionalistas del Kuomintang son aplastante e irreversiblemente derrotadas por los comunistas de Mao. Así, Chiang Kai-shek y los nacionalistas se ven obligados a radicarse en la pequeña isla de Taiwán, dando inicio a la larga controversia actual entre Taiwán y la China continental. En cuanto a los comunistas, estos terminan por proclamar la República Popular China el 1 de octubre de 1949, bajo la ideología comunista de Mao Zedong, quien es nombrado líder supremo de la nación hasta su muerte en 1976. La mayoría de los historiadores suelen situar el fin del siglo de la humillación el mismo día de la proclamación de la República Popular China, pues en cuyo discurso inaugural Mao Zedong pronunció las siguientes palabras poderosas. Abro comillas, nuestra nación no será más una nación humillada. Nos hemos puesto de pie. Cierro comillas. Con el paso del tiempo, China emprenderá hasta nuestros días un accidentado pero largo y exitoso camino en vías hacia la modernización y la independencia económica que la han hecho a día de hoy una superpotencia que ha superado económicamente a varias de las antiguas naciones que la humillaron en el siglo XIX, compitiendo cabeza a cabeza con los Estados Unidos e incurriendo también en la subyugación y explotación de otros países menos desarrollados. Así, el siglo de la humillación, como periodo de tiempo histórico, se ha mantenido presente tanto en las relaciones diplomáticas de China con Occidente como en la psique colectiva de los chinos, que les recuerda, casi como un mantra, la humillación a la que nunca más como pueblo deben regresar. Queridos amigos, gracias por acompañarnos hasta el final del video. Esperamos que haya sido de su agrado. Les recordamos que su apoyo es fundamental para el crecimiento de este gran proyecto. Por eso los invitamos a dejar su me gusta, a dejar su comentario, a suscribirse, a compartir nuestro contenido con todos sus amigos y a estar pendiente a las próximas entregas. Nos vemos en otra ocasión.